Patriot Day 2021, commemorating 20 years. We can talk about the longest war in U.S. history, but just deciding to end a war doesn't mean the war is actually over. A war ends when there is a clear winner and a clear loser. One side can say they're no longer going to fight in a war, but that does not mean the other side will stop fighting too. If the war that was authorized in 2001 is now over, what happened in Afghanistan this year has one and only one interpretation. The United States lost the war on terror. Mission accomplished for our enemies. And the great superpower who lost the war on terror lost it to the very same entity that woke us up to the fact that we were at war in the first place. Yes, 20 years ago, for a very brief moment in time, the American people woke up. Not only did they understand for the first time that there were people in the world that wanted them dead, that wanted to bring a great country built on liberty principles and virtue, they wanted to bring that kind of country to its knees, but the American people also woke up to the fact that their fellow Americans were not the enemy. Empathy was at an all-time high because we were really actually feeling what everyone else was feeling. We had an intense shared traumatic experience, and petty and political division just kind of disappeared as contempt was replaced with true, authentic and empathy. We were kind to each other, to strangers, like we'd never been before. We said we will always remember, we will never forget, but I think we've forgotten. So what should we remember exactly? Remember the stories of the lost, their last words said over telephone lines, the love they had for their families. We probably knew some of them, and after their stories came out, we felt like we knew them. Remember that. Remember the courage of the passengers on Flight 93. Civilians who fought back and gave their lives so no more Americans had to die, and so that the symbol of our government, the Capitol building, would not be destroyed, essentially the symbolic destruction of our foundational principles of liberty. Remember the courage of the passengers on Flight 93. Remember the heroism of our first responders, the ones who led people to safety, who died in the rescue effort, the ones who never went home. And remember realizing for the first time that these heroes signed up for that, and they deserve honor, they deserve respect. Remember that. Remember our military service members, a completely volunteer and thus virtuous military. No, I'm not saying all service members are virtuous as individual people, but if you know Aquinas, nothing is virtuous unless it is voluntary. And these are men and women who voluntarily put their lives on the line for the principles and ideals that this country was built upon. And they do this voluntarily every day. So remember that about our military service members. We have the most virtuous military in the world. Remember September 12th, that feeling of American unity, even patriotism, which is somehow now a bad word, but that American unity that led to everyday kindness, the kind of kindness that only comes with true, authentic empathy. Remember that. Remember what it was like to be empathetic. Remember the strength that comes with the solidarity of the free world. Why do you think we had so many allies in Afghanistan and even Iraq all these years? Because they believed in our foundational principles and ideals of liberty and virtue. An attack against us was an attack against those foundational principles, and thus an attack against all freedom-loving people across the entire globe. So remember the strength that comes with the solidarity of the free world. Remember the search for meaning, the search for spiritual truth, the search for God, the search for hope. And remember, we are at war, and it was never about oil or the body count. It is a war of ideas and ideology. It is a war for hearts and minds. It is also a war of freedom versus fear, a war of liberty versus tyranny. The war on terror was easiest to identify in jihadists because they're very clear about their intentions. They know they're fighting for an ideology, for a mind, for a heart. They know they want tyranny and not liberty. They know they want fear, not freedom. Osama bin Laden was clear about this. ISIS was clear about this. Al-Qaeda is clear about this. The Taliban is clear about this. Iran is clear about this, which is why it has been so easy to point to jihadism, because it exists elsewhere, but just not as obvious in those other places. Yet even though the jihadists are very clear that this is a war for hearts and minds, freedom versus fear, liberty versus tyranny, and they tell us about it, we forgot. So remember, we are at war. The end of the war is declared only when one side completely surrenders to the other. Do not surrender to fear and tyranny. 2,996 people, including the 19 hijackers, died in the 9/11 attacks. And their deaths woke us up. We owed it to them to not fall asleep again, but we did. We fell asleep. And 2,455 U.S. service members gave their lives in Afghanistan, and according to my edition, based on figures from a government website, 3,481, I think, died in the war on terror to create the very circumstances in which it became possible for us to fall asleep again. We fell asleep. We dropped the ball, people. Never forget. If we had not forgotten, we would be full of empathy instead of moral superiority and hatred. If we had not forgotten, we would be unified instead of divided. If we had not forgotten, we would not see liberty-minded Americans as our enemies. If we had not forgotten, we would recognize fear as the enemy of freedom, something we used to all believe in. If we had not forgotten, our churches would be full instead of empty. If we had not forgotten, we would not dishonor first responders like our police officers and firefighters. If we had not forgotten, we would not dishonor our military servicemen and women. No, we would give them honor. We would respect them and the decisions they made to protect us, to be there for us, no matter what we believe or what we think. If we had not forgotten, we would not be blinded to the war for hearts and minds that continues to swirl around us. If we had not forgotten, we would recognize evil and not celebrate it, but fight against it. If we had not forgotten. There is now an entire generation of adults that is not even old enough to remember. So it is up to those of us who do remember to explain why it is important to never forget. So, to all the adults in the room, remember, shake off the slumber and put your boots on. We are still at war, and it is a battle for hearts and minds. Tyranny is on the march, and it is winning. It's winning. It's winning over the hearts and minds through fear and force and manipulation and deception. And tyranny's march won't stop just because we stop fighting. Tyranny will win, because falling asleep again means we will ultimately surrender completely. So commemorate Patriot Day this year. Truly remember, and then never again forget.